Thank you, Alistair, and thanks to the AIA for hosting me here this evening. A real pleasure for me to be here. It's actually my first time in Australia, so I'm very excited to be here. So what I wanted to do this evening was, rather than run you through the global strategy, sort of chapter by chapter, which I guess you can do by just reading it if you're interested, is really giving you a sense of where we were and where we've come to, by taking as reference points 2003, which was when the first and only European security strategy was published, and 2016, when the first and for the time being only EU global strategy was produced. And let me run you through those changes, talking about the change in context, the change in process, the change in content, and the change in output or action. So context, and let's rewind back to where Europe was in 2003. Now, the opening lines of the European security strategy back then was, Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, or so free. And that indeed was the way in which the world looked like from the European vantage point back in 2003. 3 years before then, the euro had been launched, by far the most important and successful project of European integration. 1 year after 2003, i.e. in 2004, the European Union almost doubled in size, i.e. it enlarged to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. It was on the eve of launching what then became the European Neighbourhood Policy, which was basically the policy aimed at those countries that were knocking at the door. They wanted to come in, but of course the European Union already back then knew that it couldn't enlarge forever, and so it was trying to devise basically a policy which was some sort of surrogate, if you like, for enlargement, a sort of enlargement-like policy with respect to these neighbours. So, in a sense, beginning with that opening line was, in that particular context, not really, it wasn't really an example of Euro hubris. It really was, in a sense, the times that we were living in. Now, this was also framed in a broader international context, in which the international liberal order was essentially unchallenged. It was unchallenged. We were at the height of what back then was known as the American unipolar moment. And of course, this is not to say that it was not a time without its difficulties. It was. And particularly if one thinks back at those years and the reasons why the EU decided, and then High Representative Solana decided to embark on the first European security strategy, it was precisely because of those differences and difficulties. But those difficulties were basically related precisely to that role of the United States in the world. Those differences were due to the fact that the US had decided to go into Iraq, and that essentially created a split in Europe between France and Germany back then that were against the Iraq War, and the UK that was in favour. So the European security strategy was basically a strategy aimed at mending over that divide that essentially had split the continent and had paralysed Europe in those years. And I say all this because it's important to remember and sort of have very clear in mind what a particular context is for a particular document, because although the document doesn't go into the nitty-gritty of the moment, it's inevitably informed by that particular historical moment. So let's fast forward to the 2 years that it took to produce the European Global Strategy, and what was the world looking like, and what was Europe looking like? What does it look like now? Well, it's clear that the EU is surrounded not by a ring of friends, but what is now commonly known as a ring of fire. There has been, of course, the annexation of Crimea by Russia. There has been the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. There has been the implosion of the Middle East. So it is not simply the war in Syria or in Libya, which are, of course, the most extreme examples of this, but basically we're talking about an implosion, a potential implosion of an entire state system, which has essentially been around since the end of World War I. So an imploding South, with violence obviously within the region, but also spilling in to the European Union, and of course terrorism is the most blatant, if you like, example of this. An assertive Russia, which has, in a sense, reawakened from its initial post-Cold War sense of inferiority, and is making itself felt and heard, if you like, to the east. And then, of course, there are problems within Europe itself. And I would argue that these are not problems which are necessarily specific to Europe. I think that what basically we're living through is a broader problem and a broader crisis of Western democracies in many respects. The rise of populism, the rise of Euroscepticism, a rise of Euroscepticism which is intrinsically connected to a rejection of globalization. Because this is basically what we're talking about. And this is basically also what informed the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom, although, of course, it was interpreted in a specific, if you like, EU, there was a specific EU slant to it. Because in a sense, if you think about it, the European Union is the most extreme form, almost, of globalization. It is interdependence, if you like, to the extreme. So I say all this simply to highlight the fact that the context in which we're in today informs a opening sentence of the EU global strategy which admits that the EU is in a state of existential crisis. Now, my belief, my strong belief, not only my hope, my strong belief is that in the end we will manage to weather the storm simply because there is no alternative. There is no alternative to interdependence. There is no alternative to connectivity, if you like, in the 21st century. But yet, we have to recognize that this is the existential challenge that we're in. And so the global strategy really had to start, if you like, from that particular starting point and an observation. The second set of issues, which I wanted to touch on, again, comparing back from 2003 to 2016, is really the difference in the process. So back in 2003, it was a fairly simple exercise. There was one aim, i.e. healing the mend, if you like, healing the divide over Iraq. And basically 3 seminars were organized in 3 different European capitals. There were a couple of meetings in the Political and Security Committee, which is the preparatory body, if you like, of the Foreign Affairs Council, representing member states. And the job was done, and Solana presented the document to the European Council, and the European Council, that was composed of 15 member states at the time, adopted it. Now, I wish my life had been so easy. This process was a radically different process, and it was a radically different process because it really had to respond to a radically different context. It's a process that took the best part of 2 years. We did not organize 3, but we organized more than 50 events. Most of these were within the European Union. So in each and every capital, i.e. in each of the 28 capitals, we organized at least one very large event. Most of the time it was co-sponsored by the National Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the presence of the Foreign Minister, in some cases of the Defense Minister. In the case of Slovenia, it was the President. So it was at a fairly high level. We organized a sort of huge, actually, you only need to look at the annex of this document to get a sense of how many, if you like, participated in this process. And the reason why we had to do it and we had to organize it in this way was because, unlike in 2003, this was really about recreating a common narrative that could answer or provide a partial answer precisely to this rise of Euroscepticism and populism, and basically frontal attack on the European Union. And in a sense, the argument we're trying to make throughout the document, I mean, one of the big narratives coming out, if you like, of this document is, you know, you can love or hate the European Union, but the truth is that, the point that I was making earlier, in a world in which power is shifting from west to east, in which power is diffusing beyond state boundaries, in which we are increasingly connected in terms of flows of people, in terms of technology, in terms of markets, the truth is that member states acting on their own or acting disjointly will not be able to achieve anything in world affairs. And by not achieving anything in world affairs, they will not be able to provide security and prosperity to their populations. And this is basically the big story coming out of this document. And the process, in a sense, had to be designed so as to allow for that broader conversation which did not limit itself to the walls of official institutions, but really came out and reached the broader public. Now then, of course, there was the institutional work, the work with the diplomats and the officials, which also had its complexity, and it had its complexity firstly because unlike back in 2003, we were not aiming to produce just a security strategy. We were aiming to produce a global strategy, and the meaning of global is obviously both geographic, but it's also thematic. Meaning we didn't just want to talk about diplomacy and defense, we wanted to talk about trade and development and migration and energy and climate, and the joined up use, if you like, of all of these instruments that belong to different, the competences of which belong to different institutions. So we had to bring in, yes, the member states, and that's where the hardcore, if you like, of diplomacy and defense still lies in Europe. But then when we talk about trade or development, we're actually talking about the European Commission. And we really had to bring, if you like, these different souls of Europe together in conducting this exercise. And then obviously there was the negotiation with the member states themselves on particularly the most difficult elements, if you like, of the strategy. We had to bridge over differences that had to do with the role of European defense, with some member states having a sort of natural preference, if you like, towards NATO, other member states that are not NATO members being very wary in general about European defense issues. Member states, for example, like Ireland or like Sweden, being, feeling very nervous, if you like, about the Europeans doing more on security and defense. But then you had a very strong push from a majority of member states, particularly the French, but it was not just the French, I would say there was a real critical mass of member states that was basically saying, hey, we've got to get more serious about security and defense, because the truth is that moving forward, the US, we can discuss then, under a Trump or under a Clinton, but there is a structural trend behind essentially the United States feeling that its own national security interests do not necessarily lie in Europe. And in Europe, we live in a pretty dangerous part of the world, which basically means that we've got to develop our own capacities also in terms of security and defense to face up to those threats and challenges. So, if you like, there was a big debate to be resolved over the role of European defense, and this we attempted to do, and we did in the end in the strategy. Then there was a big debate over migration in the strategy. And there I would say that there were some member states, particularly those from Central and Eastern Europe, that really didn't want to touch, if you like, anything that had to do with the internal dimensions of migration and asylum policy in particular. Well, we pushed back against that, saying, this is a document that makes of, in a sense, the internal-external nexus, i.e. the fact that across different policy areas, actually there is no way of clearly separating the way in which that policy is conducted inside or outside, because if you want to obtain a particular effect, you really have to look at these two, if you like, together. And migration is probably the most evident case in point. If you want to have an effective migration policy, you cannot just have a policy of external migration in which you give aid to origin and transit countries in order to keep migrants in origin or in transit countries. You cannot just have a border management policy to patrol your land and sea borders. You also need to have an internal policy, particularly when it then comes to the question of refugees. And this obviously then connects obviously to the legal right for refugees to seek protection within the European Union. So for a set of different reasons, we had to an extent, push back from, to a demand which was basically just asking us to just cover, if you like, the external rather than the internal dimensions. And then there was Russia, which is another huge area, if you like, of difference within Europe. Now, probably had we conducted this exercise in 2014, I'm not sure if we would have managed to reach an agreement over the Russia point. It was extremely fresh and emotions ran very high. And there was still a general, I would say, lack of understanding, I say this as an Italian, a general lack of understanding in some member states, including my own, of the concerns of other member states, particularly those in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, if you go and speak to an Italian now, he or she will still say to you they don't feel threatened by Russia. And it's true. There is no direct Russia threat to Italy or Spain or Portugal or France or Germany for that matter. But there is a degree of empathy and understanding of the predicament of the Estonians and the Latvians and the Poles and what have you. And it took some time for that to sort of, consolidate, for that understanding. It takes a lot of talking about these things. And I say all this also to really highlight the fact that I appreciate that looking at Europe from outside sometimes gives the impression of this kind of slow elephant that really takes forever to do anything. But, when you're on the inside, we're talking about 28 different countries, basically, with different histories and different trajectories in many respects, that are together and stick together. Some, I would say, decreasingly so because of an ideal of European unity. Most, at this point, because of the sheer necessity of sticking together in a 21st century world. And you can love it or hate it, but this is where we are, and we have to somehow make it work. So, if you like, again, a process designed to really try and bridge over these differences. Third set of issues that I wanted to cover really have to do with content. And again, let me do a little comparison between 2003 and 2016. In 2003, I would say the general gist of the European security strategy was, let me say, transformational. It was about completing enlargement, and through enlargement, Europeanizing, democratizing, and modernizing the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. But it was about moving beyond that, so through what eventually became the European neighborhood policy, so using the same method and instruments, but not with the ultimate same result of enlargement themselves, to continue spreading norms and values and to those that were basically knocking at the door. Our approach to regional organizations, take ASEAN for example, it was, yes, we support you and we're going to support you to become more like us, because ultimately we are the best case of European, of regional integration, the sort of golden, golden level, and we're gonna, we're magnanimous enough to help you become more like us. And then at the international level, it was, and again, this was very much informed by the Iraq War, it was really about preserving the system because of the, in a sense, US attack on the United Nations in that particular context. One of the sort of catchphrases of the European security strategy was effective multilateralism. Effective multilateralism basically aimed at bridging over that divide that I was mentioning earlier. So multilateralism, basically saying we've got to preserve the United Nations. And this was, in a sense, much more of a French-German position. And then, if you like, some winking and nodding at the Brits, saying yes, but multilateralism has to be effective. It's not any old multilateralism. But basically, we were in the game of preserving the existing multilateral system. Now, all of those conditions, the last thing that I wanted to mention actually does have to do with the United States. And it is really the fact that in the 2003 European security strategy, the United States is, in a sense, the be-all and end-all of the strategy. It was the lens through which we observed the world. Now, it was not necessarily present in terms of how many times you do a word count or you do a search, how many times does the United States come up? Yes, it comes out a lot, and it comes out a lot in this document too. But it was basically the overarching prism through which we observed the world. Now, if we fast forward to today, how have those approaches changed? I would say that we're no longer in Europe in a transformational mode, but we're in, transactional is the wrong term to use. The term that we use in the strategy is principled pragmatism. Now, what does that mean? It does not mean that you have to compromise on your principles out of pragmatic considerations. What it does mean is that you have to observe the world for what it is, not for what you would like to imagine it to be like. And the truth is that actually the rest of the world doesn't really necessarily want to become like you. Yes, there are some countries that indeed want to move closer to the European Union, and particularly we're talking about countries in the accession process, so countries in the Western Balkans, to an extent Turkey. Some of the countries which currently fall within the scope of the European neighbourhood policy, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, down south, Tunisia, Morocco, but that's pretty much where the list ends. All other countries, and they're still neighbours, they're very important partners to the European Union, do not actually want to Europeanize. And that is a fact which was almost unthinkable 13 years ago. And now we have to recognize, we have to be pragmatic about it. But does that mean that that anything goes? That therefore we have to accept our nice authoritarian leaders, left, right, and center, because we have to be pragmatic and realistic and, if you like, realpolitik? No, the answer is no. We have to be principled about it. But being principled does not necessarily mean trying to replicate the European model. Now, in the strategy, we talk about resilience. And we talk about resilience precisely in order to convey that somehow, so that halfway house between, if you like, pure realpolitik, pure realism, and Europeanization and pure transformation. A resilient state and society is a society and a state which is able to adapt, to change, to respond to shocks and crises. So the argument that we make in the strategy is that actually the authoritarian state is not ultimately resilient. There is a, if you like, phony stability to authoritarian regimes, but then at some point something cracks. And what comes after is generally very bad news. You just need to look exactly at the Libyas and the Syrias, etc., to get a sense, if you like, or Egypt, if you like, as well, to get a sense of what that means. But yet the resilient state, and therefore the state which is to an extent inclusive and modern and does not necessarily have to implement the acquis communautaire, the body, if you like, of EU laws and regulations. There are different ways, if you like, different paths to build resilience. And we, as the European Union, have to be able to respond, if you like, to different paths and models. Likewise, when it comes to regional organizations, yes, we have to support different forms of regional organization, but not necessarily because everyone's going to end up looking like the European Union. Again, there are different ways and different paths, if you like, to build closer relationships within regions. And we have certainly our story to tell, and it remains, to an extent, the most successful story to date. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the path that others will follow. The other, I think, important difference between 2003 and 2016 is this point about the United States. As I said, back in 2003, this was really the lens through which we observed the world. In this document, the US is mentioned, and it's mentioned many times. It's actually mentioned using the term core partner, which is a term that is used basically only on 3 occasions. We talk about core partners when we talk about the United States, the United Nations, and NATO. So basically, the actor that we're going to do most things with, be it in economic terms, be it in security terms. So it's an important actor, but it is not the prism through which we observe the world anymore. And in fact, the first priority of this document, which is about building a more secure EU, is all about growing up, particularly in security and defense terms. And this goes back to the reflection, if you like, and the appreciation, which, by the way, the Americans have been trying to tell us for quite some time, i.e., don't necessarily count on us moving forward. Yes, we're going to, work together, but you've got to grow up. There has to be a degree of, if you like, European strategic maturity in the years and decades that are to come. So the US is there, but not as the overarching prism, but as a key partner, if you like, for the European Union as an actor. The final difference, I would say, really has to do with the international system. As I was saying earlier, in 2003, it was about preserving the system. In 2016, we cannot simply hope to preserve the system as it is. Either the system transforms, and by transforming, it basically means it needs to reform, and to reform, we basically need to accept the fact that we will need to have a smaller share of the pie in terms of representation. Because you know what's going to happen if we're going to keep on, holding on to our chairs, that at some point, and it's already in a sense beginning to happen, other organizations are going to pop up in their stead. Now, the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank is one example, and it's the first example. And others are to follow if there is this, if you like, resistance, and it's not just about Europeans, of course, but if there is this resistance, if you like, to transform the system, an alternative system is likely to emerge instead. So in a sense, when it comes to the international system, there is a transformational approach which was lacking, if you like, in the past. And the last set of issues that I wanted to touch on is really about the output, or the outcome, the action of all of this. In 2003, it was a fairly short document, about half the size of this document, and it was just about painting the story. It was about painting that common narrative that Europeans needed to bridge over the differences after Iraq. And the truth is that it was less necessary to focus on the action because we were doing quite well. There was less of a need to act. Now, it would be unfair to say that there was no action that followed from that document. I think there was, meaning there were policies like the European neighbourhood policies, the creation of the European Defence Agency. There were, the headline goal process, which now everyone wants to forget, which is basically the process whereby the European Union set out its targets in terms of how many troops it wants to be able to deploy, if you like, moving forward. We never met that target, by the way. There were some actions that followed, but they were not direct products, if you like, of the European security strategy. They were loosely connected, loosely informed, if you like, by the ESS. Now, in the current context, because of the gravity of the situation that we're living in, we cannot stop at the picture. We cannot stop at the common narrative. And that's why the title of this document is precisely Shared Vision, Common Action. A shared vision is a piece of paper. And it's this process of strategic reflection, the 2 years of talks and debates, if you like, that led to this document. But now's where the real work starts in many ways. So this is where we are now, which is the first steps, if you like, of the action. And Federica Mogherini, the High Representative Vice President of the Commission, was immediately, the minute in which this was published, already in August we started working on a roadmap for implementation. Focusing on, first year, 2016, 2017, which would be the first blocks, if you like, of implementation. An important push forward was given, what was it, last week, 2 weeks ago, last week, at the Bratislava, the informal summit of the 27 member states, so without the UK, in which, if you like, the tasking was explicitly given to her to develop an implementation plan, particularly on security and defence, which, and this is my current headache at the moment, we have to deliver by the end of the year. So all this to say that unlike 2003, whereas back then, if you like, the condition for success was only that of having that shared vision. Today, this particular process and this particular document will be considered successful if it's actually followed by action. And that is, so in a sense, the bar is much higher than it was back then. Again, for the simple reason, and I sort of go back from where I started and where I'll end, the context that we're living in is existential, which of course was not the case back in the early 2000s.